My fantasy football team is one of the worst in history through 4 games. Wait, is it? Yeah, at 0-4 through the first 4 weeks, it's the only remaining winless team in my league, but somehow in the upper half of the league in points scored? I guess that's what happens when your team has the second most points scored against it. Being someone who's more drawn to deterministic competition than probabilistic competition, that is, I'm drawn to competition that skews more towards skill than luck. You can understand why I hate fantasy football so much that my friends are only successful in dragging me kicking and screaming into their leagues once every 5 years or so. This is why I enjoy games like basketball and chess where the outcome is largely determined by myself as opposed to forces out of my control. However, as a creative professional, as a designer, I see opportunity in every flaw that life throws at me. That is, the opportunity to come up with a creative solution to a problem. Let's examine some of the flaws of fantasy football and see what, if any, reasonable design solutions exist to mitigate those flaws. Based on the nature of how fantasy sports is supposed to work, the first issue I see isn't exactly a flaw, nor do I believe it has a reasonable solution, but I'm going to bring it up anyway because it will lead to the glaring flaw that in part inspired this rant. Unlike head-to-head competition in real sports, in fantasy sports there's absolutely nothing I could do about my opponent's score. If my opponent has a player who has a career game, I just have to hope and pray my team has some players who play above their average output on that given day, and that I started those players. That leads to the flaw I see not just in fantasy football, but in fantasy sports in general. The fact that you are locked into your starting lineup for that period of competition without the ability to get contributions from your bench. Consider how the real sports world works. You have a team with a roster of starters and backups. The starters start the game and are generally given the bulk of the playing time due to their high skill level. The backups are available and ready whenever a substitution is necessary. One situation in which a substitution is necessary is an injury. In the real sports world, when a player goes down, a backup fills in and replaces at least some of the missed production of the injured player. That doesn't exist in fantasy sports. In fantasy sports, if you start a player who gets injured at the beginning of the game, you're basically playing in a disadvantaged handicap competition where your team is outnumbered. Similarly, if you started a player who gives you basically no production, that can also feel like a handicap in favor of your opponent, which can be particularly frustrating if one of the players on your bench has a good game. Again, think about how real sports works. If a starter struggles, the coach has the freedom to bench that player in favor of a backup who could give that team some production. So, what are the possible design solutions to these issues? After barely thinking about this at all because this subject isn't particularly important considering the real-world problems I could be applying my design skills to, I came up with this solution. Fantasy leagues can enable managers to create weighted depth charts that provide safety nets for extreme circumstances. Let's use the quarterback position as an example since it only has one starter. In a weighted depth chart, a manager can assign QBs 1, 2, and 3 representing the starter, the backup, and the emergency quarterbacks respectively. This depth chart will automatically default to the stats of the top scoring player at that position. But Raymond, isn't that cheating? Doesn't it take away from the prediction spirit of fantasy football? The answer is yes it does, and that is where the weighted part comes in. In this system, the QB1 stats will be weighed at a 100% value. The QB2 stats will be weighed at some arbitrary low value, let's say 75%. The QB3 stats will also be weighed at some arbitrary low value, let's say 50%. So say you were crazy enough to start one of the New York quarterbacks during week 3. Let's just go with Daniel Jones because he was miraculously owned by 43% of Yahoo managers that week. Against the 49ers, he put up just 9.06 fantasy points, which is a very bench the guy in the middle of the game performance. Now imagine in a weighted depth chart system, you assign Kirk Cousins to your QB2 spot and Josh Allen to your QB3 spot. If you multiply Cousins' 21.44 points by 0.75 and Allen's 32.24 points by 0.5, you get these fantasy point totals for the 3 quarterbacks on your depth chart. In this system, your team is awarded 16.12 points from the QB position because Josh Allen had the top weighted point total. So this system accounts for a couple of extreme circumstances. If the starter gets hurt early in the game, you won't lose all of your points from that position. Or, if a starter performs at a level that would almost certainly get him benched in a real game, your team isn't stuck with his output unless you have no viable backups. And lastly, in this hypothetical, your team would have been rewarded 32.24 points instead of just 16.12 had you started Allen instead of Jones, which means this system still values the prediction nature of traditional fantasy sports. And yes, I realize the irony of using a New York quarterback in this scenario as an example of the one you should start, because the state of New York is indeed represented by 3 NFL teams, not 2.